its size, the Royal Navy had too few escort vessels. Many merchant ships had to sail alone. And by the end of 1939, more than 100 had been sunk. It quickly became apparent that the British had woefully underestimated the submarine threat. On September the 17th, U-29 sank the British aircraft carrier Courageous. On October the 14th, the battleship Royal Oak was sunk when U-47 slipped through the defences of the British main fleet base at Scapa Flow in the Orkneys. Meanwhile, Germany's small surface fleet had also been unleashed against the sea lanes. In the North Sea, the battle cruisers Scharnhorst and Gneisenau intercepted a convoy on November the 22nd. They sank its escort, the armed merchant cruiser Rawalpindi. But it was the pocket battleship Graf Spee which caused the greatest problems. Designed specifically for commerce raiding, its 11-inch guns could overwhelm any ship fast enough to overtake it, and it had the speed to escape from any battleship. The Graf Spee had slipped away from Germany before hostilities began. Soon it was cutting loose in the South Atlantic and Indian Oceans. Finally, 3 British cruisers, Exeter, Ajax and Achilles, intercepted it off the River Plate on the east coast of South America. The British ships damaged the pocket battleship so badly that it had to take refuge in the neutral Uruguayan port of Montevideo. The Germans were then fooled into thinking that a more powerful British force had arrived. When the Graf Spee was commanded to leave port, her captain scuttled her rather than risk annihilation. Back home, the Royal Navy crews were feted as heroes. But this was just about the only obvious success enjoyed by the British or French armed forces during the winter of 1939. Though the British did enjoy one secret victory in the technological war, which was to prove vital. As soon as the war began, Britain began to lose large numbers of ships to German mines. What was so mysterious was that the ships didn't seem to have actually struck them. The mines had simply exploded as the ships passed nearby. Then, on the night of November the 22nd, 1939, a German plane was spotted dropping a mine at low tide in the Thames estuary. Disarmed and rescued from the mud, the mine was found to be set off by the magnetic signature of a ship passing close by. The solution was to reduce a ship's magnetic signature by hanging a copper cable round the hull and then passing an electric current through it, a process called degaussing. Once degaussing was applied to all ships, the danger from the magnetic mine was massively reduced. But otherwise, as 1940 began, the war was quiet. The two sides did little during the winter except to patrol, train, and try to keep warm, for it was a particularly cold one. An American journalist called it the Phony War. For the Germans, it was the Sitzkrieg. In the spring, the British Expeditionary Force took up its position towards the left of the front on the Belgian border. But it was dwarfed by its French ally. France had some 100 divisions along the Belgian and German frontiers or in reserve nearby. This imbalance meant that the British commander, Lord Gort, had to go along with the ideas of the French general Maurice Gamelin. And these were entirely defensive. French hopes were pinned on the massive ramparts of the Maginot Line. A series of fortifications, it ran from Switzerland to Belgium along the French-German border. The Maginot Line was considered to be completely impassable and would ensure that French territory remained safe. But otherwise, the Allies had no idea of how actually to defeat Germany. Instead, they brought up their forces and prepared for a repeat of World War I. They would blockade Germany to sap its strength, and they would dig in, ready to grind down the assault which they knew must come. None of their commanders seemed to consider that the Germans might have totally different ideas, or that the next moves might come in a completely different arena. Scandinavia. On November the 30th, 1939, a new theatre of war was opened up. The Soviet Union invaded its tiny neighbor, Finland. Finland had only achieved independence from the Russians in 1918 and hated them. Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin was convinced that one day the Finns might allow the Germans in to attack Leningrad and the vital Arctic port of Murmansk. The Red Army outnumbered its Finnish opponents by more than 10 to 1. The invasion should have been a walkover. But its leadership had been devastated by Stalin's terrible purges. The Finns were led by General Gustav Mannerheim. He fought back using hit-and-run tactics amid the deep snow, often on skis. The Soviet troops, confused and poorly led, suffered massive losses. Finland's gallant resistance caught the imagination of the British and French. Soon they were planning to send help via Norway and Sweden. The fact that this might suck two neutral countries into the war was ignored. But a renewed Soviet offensive at the beginning of February broke the Finnish defensive line. In early March, the Finns had to cede territory to Stalin. By now, Hitler too had become interested in Scandinavia. The Nazi war machine relied on iron ore from Sweden. In the winter months, the only way it could get to Germany was via the Norwegian port of Narvik. If the Allies landed in Norway, this vital supply could be cut off. So he ordered plans to be prepared for an invasion of Norway. Denmark, which was in the way, would also have to be seized. The Norway theatre heated up on February the 16th, 1940. The British destroyer Cossack boarded the German supply ship Altmark in a Norwegian fjord to release prisoners. Then, on April the 9th, German troops began landing at 5 ports: Oslo, Kristiansand, Bergen, Trondheim, and Narvik. At the same time, men of their newly formed German parachute division seized Stavanger and Oslo airfields. The Norwegian defenders were swiftly overwhelmed, as were the Danes. German forces occupied their country within 24 hours. In Norway, the Germans moved swiftly to link up their beachheads and seize all the major towns. In the air, the Luftwaffe had total control. The Allies now responded. A landing force was dispatched to recapture Narvik. French and Norwegian forces achieved this on May the 28th. But a substantial German force was now approaching. So 6 weeks later, the Allies abandoned Norway to its fate. Hitler had spent most of that winter and spring at his country retreat, the Berghof in southern Bavaria. For him, the events in Scandinavia were a sideshow. Instead, he was preparing for his next major blitzkrieg against Britain and France. The first plan his generals brought him had a familiar ring to it. The Germans would advance into Belgium, aiming to swing down towards Paris. It was a repeat of the Schlieffen Plan, which the Germans had used at the start of World War I. The Allies were expecting this, and their main strategic discussion was how to prepare for it. When the Germans attacked, the Allies planned that their forces west of the Maginot Line would swing forward into Belgium to hold them on the shorter and more defensible line of the rivers Dyle and Meuse. Then, on January the 10th, 1940, a German liaison aircraft lost its way and crashed in Belgium. A copy of the German plan was found. This convinced the Allies that their Dyle plan must be right, and they deployed their troops accordingly. Unfortunately, the same event made the Germans alter their ideas entirely. Chief planner General Erich von Manstein had always thought the original plan unimaginative. He was worried that the German forces would become bogged down, as in World War I, and that his country would lose a long, drawn-out war. So he proposed to Hitler that the main thrust should be made at the point where the Maginot Line ended, and where the Allies were most vulnerable as their Western armies moved forward. Virtually all Germany's panzers would be gathered opposite the Ardennes in southeast Belgium. The Allies considered this hilly and wooded area almost impassable for tanks. It was, therefore, lightly defended. The plan was to drive deep behind the Allied armies, which would have advanced into Belgium. They could then cut them off, and all the forces sitting in the Maginot Line would be bypassed. It was a high-risk strategy. The German armor could become stuck in the forest, but Hitler loved it. So the German forces were redeployed without the Allies knowing. The Allies, meanwhile, prepared for their long defensive war. In addition to the formidable barrier of the Maginot Line, they had a slight advantage both in manpower, some 110 divisions available against 95 German, and in armor, about 3,000 vehicles against 2,700. The French also had the better tanks. Their 32-ton Char Bay had both 75 and 47mm guns. Its disadvantage was that the main gun was mounted in the hull, and so was difficult to aim. The other gun was in a one-man turret, from which the commander had to control the tank as well as man the gun. In contrast, the newest German design, the 17-ton Panzer Mark IV, had a 75mm gun in a spacious three-man turret, so its crew could work as a team, though only about 100 were available. The other main French tanks also had guns which matched those of their German counterparts, but again the French had the one-man turret. The one area where the Germans had a clear advantage was in the air. The Luftwaffe had 2,000 bombers, the Allies just 800. The Luftwaffe had 4,000 fighters, including the ultra-modern Messerschmitt BA